The South African Jewish Board of Deputies has openly slammed South Africa's move to file a genocide probe application against Israel at the International Court of Justice. In its application, Pretoria is of the view that Israeli forces have violated the United Nations Genocide Convention over the war in the neighbouring Gaza Strip. But to help us understand their dissatisfaction, we're joined by Professor Karen Milner, chairperson of the South African Jewish Board of Deputies. Professor, very good evening. Happy 2024 and appreciate your time this evening. Now, speak to us about your qualms with the South African government.
Good evening and Happy New Year to everybody watching, and hoping and praying that it will be a peaceful year. I think that the one thing that the South African Jewish Board of Deputies has in common with the South African government is a real desire to see peace in the war between Hamas and Israel, between Gaza and Israel. But I think that the way that they have gone about it, and certainly the inclusion in their pleadings of the South African Jewish Board of Deputies in their pleadings, is completely inappropriate. If we're looking to find real peace on the ground, then you need to do the real work of making peace, which is the way South Africa has operated in every other conflict in the world. And that really means engaging with both sides. South Africa has shown that it has relationship with Hamas. Hamas was in South Africa recently. One of the quickest, and clearly the quickest way to end this war, would be the release of the over 100 hostages that are still in Gaza. And one would imagine that efforts should be placed on releasing those hostages and calling for the release of hostages, and using the relationship with Hamas to call for the release of those hostages, rather than what seems to be a largely symbolic gesture aimed simply at demonizing Israel.
How many hostages are still held captive, Professor?
So I don't have the exact numbers at my fingertips, because a number of hostages were released. There's also been a number of hostages have tragically been killed, and bodies of hostages bodies of hostages have been found. Tragically, there are over 100 hostages still in Gaza, and this still includes women and children, and in fact babies.
So let's shift our attention a little bit to the meeting that the South African Jewish Board of Deputies had with the office of President Cyril Ramaphosa towards the back end of last year. Speak to us about that conversation and what the intended outcome was.
Sure. So the meeting was at the request of the South African Jewish Board of Deputies, and it was explicitly, when we asked for the meeting, around really three things. It was first and foremost, and most importantly, around the growing levels of anti-Semitism in South Africa. So we have unfortunately seen a massive spike in anti-Semitism in South Africa over the last 2 months. And we felt that it was important as South African citizens, and it is the mandate of the Jewish Board of Deputies to protect the rights of South African Jews. We felt it was important to have a meeting with our president to alert him to our concerns around the rising levels of anti-Semitism, which have grown exponentially in the last 2 months. South Africa is traditionally a country with very low levels of anti-Semitism, and thankfully we have seen relatively little violence in this country, but for the first time in a number of years, we have seen examples of violent anti-Semitism. So the first and primary reason for the meeting was to alert our president to the concern about the attacks on Jews in this country, so that we could get some reassurance from him about the fact that anti-Semitism would not be tolerated in the country. Associated with that, there have been boycotts of South African Jewish businesses in South Africa, both obviously as Jewish citizens and as South African citizens. It was a tremendous concern for us that businesses were being placed potentially at risk, and a boycott of Jewish businesses, which is fundamentally an anti-Semitic position. So that was the second key reason that we wanted to meet with him. The third was a very practical issue, and that is the withdrawal of the South African embassy in Tel Aviv, including all the consulate staff, left us with a very practical problem of how to address the rights of South African Jews in Israel, so South African citizens in Israel, who had no access to consular or diplomatic services in a time and a region at war. And we gave examples, for example, a person who lost her passport, a baby who was born, who needed to come back to South Africa and needed a South African passport. And we just needed to know how to address the issue of the fact that there is no accessible consular services for South African citizens who happen to find themselves in Israel. So that was the reason for the meeting. And we made that very clear to the President and expressed that in our meeting.
Now, how does the government argue that Israel is in breach of its obligations in terms of the Genocide Convention? Because that really is a problem, according to the South African government.
So, I mean, you know, I'm no lawyer, so it's not easy to... I've read through the documentation, and to quote a lawyer I do know, anything is arguable in court. You know, you can take any position, and find lawyers who you can pay, and you can take them to the court of law and see whether or not your case is found to be righteous or not. Obviously, for obvious reasons, we disagree that this is the case, and you know, I'm not sure why the government has decided at this point, at this moment.
What's the point of your disagreement, Professor? You disagree that it's not a genocide. Why?
Well, it's a war. There's a war situation going on at the moment. I don't think that the intention, and again, I'm not a lawyer, so I think that there are technical details around genocide that I'm not.
Well, let me put your mind at ease, Professor. Allow me to explain to you what a genocide is, what the elements are. So the perpetrator inflicted certain conditions of life upon one or more persons. That's number one. Number two, the perpetrator intended to destroy in whole or in part the national, ethnical, racial or religious group as such. The conditions of life were calculated to bring about the physical destruction of that group in whole or in part. So according to the definition by the United Nations Convention of what a genocide is, in one or two of those areas, the continued bombardment of Gaza by Israel constitutes a genocide, which is why the South African government, according to that interpretation, have approached the International Court of Justice.
The bombardment of Gaza is part of a war that was started by Hamas. There is no intent on the part of the Israeli government to destroy a religion or to destroy an entirety of a country or a people. So while I absolutely, and I want to make this absolutely clear, I'm horrified by the loss of civilian life on both sides. And I think that the loss of civilian life on both sides is absolutely tragic. The reality is Hamas started this war. They came and perpetrated a massacre in Israel. They then stated categorically that they would return and repeat that massacre again and again and again and again until they had killed all Jews in Israel. So if you're talking about a genocide, I think that in terms of intent, Hamas certainly had the intent to commit a genocide, and I am wondering, although I know South Africa mentioned Hamas, why this wasn't included in the pleadings. Israel then is responding to Hamas's intended, openly stated intention to continue attacking, massacring every man, woman and child in Israel. I think that in defense of that, and in particular in relation to the hostages, there is an argument to be made that an act of war is needed to defend Israel from the stated intention of Hamas. And the tragedy is the loss of civilian life, but that can end. That can end immediately with the release of the hostages. And that's why I'm so puzzled. Anybody who is looking to end this war needs to recognize that Hamas can end this war by releasing the hostages. Why are they not doing so?
So, Professor, allow me to ask this. I mean, you speak on behalf of the South African Jewish Board of Deputies. Now, on the 7th of October, I believe that was the date, Hamas entered Israel and it killed close to 1,200 Israelis. They then abducted a number of Israelis whom they took hostage. Some have subsequently been released. Now, to date, can you confirm of the 22,000? I think that's the number of Palestinians that have been killed in Gaza. How many of those are members of Hamas?
So I can't confirm any of the numbers. The numbers that we're receiving and the numbers that you are receiving is from the Hamas Ministry of Health. So while I'm not saying that enormous number of people have been killed, my understanding is that approximately 10,000 Hamas fighters have been killed in this war.
So of the 22,000 that have been killed, 12,000 have been innocent civilians, innocent women and children, and the 10,000 have been members of the armed Hamas.
So tragically, yes. Unfortunately, tragically,
in your view, I mean, you suggest that
are killed.
You suggest that the easiest way for this war to end is for Hamas to release a little over 100 hostages from what I believe are still being held captive, and that the 12,000 lives of young men, women, and children are equitable in this war, and that it is justified. Is that your position?
I don't think it is justified at all. I think that tragically, absolutely tragically, in a war, innocent people are sometimes killed as a result of acts of war. That has happened in every war in history, that innocent people are killed. If you are suggesting that Israel should abandon the over 100 hostages, including the babies, I'm not sure if that's what you're suggesting.
No, I'm making no suggestion. So allow me to clarify my position.
Oh, okay.
So at this point, I have no position. I'm purely posing questions that our listeners would want to ask if they were here. Now, that exact number of hostages is 115 that remain held captive by Hamas. And I suppose my next question would be.
But so you did ask a question. Because I do want to get the opportunity to answer, to understand what your question is. Because in your question you are suggesting that because there is a smaller number of hostages, then there is a death toll in the war that invalidates the war. Whereas what I'm saying is you need to look at who is responsible for this war, when this war can be ended. And that's what we are really, I think, talking past each other when we talk about this. Because you talk about the death of innocent civilians, and I agree that the death of innocent civilians is an absolute tragedy. And I would like, as much, if not more than you, because in fact, we know people who are involved in this war, to see the end of this war. There is a way to end this war. And what I'm struggling to understand is why the pressure is not being brought on Hamas to end it. Why is Hamas holding on to 100 men, women, and children?
May I suggest why the pressure is not being...
Clearly a war crime when they can end this war and end the civilian deaths. Why are they doing this?
So allow me
I don't understand.
Allow me to respond to that. My own observation, based on communications that have come through, is that Hamas at this point, in fact, post October 7th, right, have not been waging a war. A war has been waged against them physically, right?
I'm just going to interrupt you there. Hamas sent rockets last night. Rockets were fired from Hamas into central Israel. How can you say that Hamas is not waging a war? At midnight last night, Hamas launched rockets into central Israel. They have men, women, and children hostage in Gaza. They can stop launching rockets and they can release the hostages. To say that Hamas is not waging war when literally last night they launched rockets from Gaza into central Israel is ludicrous. I'm sorry.
Professor, do you feel that the onus is only on one of the two parties involved in the war to end it, and that conversations between the two parties, the two aggrieved parties, will not end the war?
I absolutely think that conversations between the two aggrieved parties will end the war, and I'm seeing that the work that has been done, for example, by Egypt, Saudi Arabia and Qatar, who have in fact proposed a ceasefire, which Israel accepted and which Hamas did not accept, which included the release of hostages and a certain amount of prisoner exchange. So certainly ceasefire is on the table. I think that what South Africa could do, given the fact that it's got the ear of Hamas, would be to do the work of getting those parties to speak to each other, finding ground where, as I said before, it is possible to end this war without any further bloodshed or loss of civilian life. What is not helpful is saying things like Hamas is not waging war in Israel when Hamas is literally launching rockets into Israel.
Well, you're absolutely right that they did fire 27 rockets yesterday. I do beg your pardon, so thank you for that correction. So moving forward, how do you expect South Africa to react, certainly to your viewpoints, post that conversation that you had with the South African government towards the back end of last year?
Well, I think it's really disappointing for the South African Jewish Board of Deputies and the South African community. We went to the President of South Africa in good faith to raise really genuine questions around anti-Semitism, the rise of anti-Semitism, violent attacks, at least one violent attack on a rabbi in South Africa, and we expected to get a fair hearing. We end up finding ourselves cited in a document which is going to be presented in a court of law. And I don't understand that the point of our meeting was to alert the government to anti-Semitism and to convey our concerns about the lack of diplomatic services for South African citizens in Israel. The fact that the South African government have twisted that meeting to incorporate them into this document really makes me wonder about their credentials and their truthfulness, because that is not what the meeting was about. The meeting was not about Israel. And there's one other thing I want to say about that. I'm a South African citizen. I'm not Israeli. I'm not an Israeli citizen. I do not represent the Israelis, nor do I represent the Israeli government. The idea that in some way the government somehow mistook talking to the Jewish community as somehow communicating with the Israeli government. And we made it clear, again, in that meeting, that that is not the case. The fact that they took, honestly, a position from their own citizens coming to speak to them on behalf of fears and the concerns that we have, and somehow suggesting that we are representing a foreign country is disgraceful anti-Semitism. There's no other way of putting it.
Why would you think they would falsify that information or falsify the contents of your conversation? Very, very quickly, we're running short of time, Professor Milner.
Okay. I honestly have no idea. Perhaps there's something I've missed, but I can tell you that a meeting that was designed to talk about anti-Semitism and was clearly intended to speak about anti-Semitism should never have been used in this way. And I personally, the Jewish Board of Deputies and the Jewish community is deeply disappointed in our government for using us in this way.
Professor Karen Milner, Chairperson of the South African Jewish Board of Deputies, appreciate your time.